We are here with health coach Rachel Horton, and today she's going to give us 3 frameworks to develop healthy habits. So, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on. One thing that we always start off with on our show is who are you and what do you do?
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Marisa. It's great to be able to have this conversation with you on a beautiful, snowy, freezing cold Sunday morning. I am Rachel Horton. I am a health coach and I specialize in cardiovascular and metabolic disease.
Very nice. And so, as a functional health coach, why did you decide to, focus specifically on cardiovascular disease?
There are a couple things that led me to this point. So, number one is this is the world I grew up in. I have seen cardiovascular disease throughout my family. This is very common, obviously, in the developing world. In the developed world, I should say, we as a nation are plagued by conditions like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. So I grew up watching my grandparents in the hospital in the cardiac unit. I saw my dad go through a 5-way bypass in his 50s, despite not being overweight or smoking or having any of the traditional risk factors. And so when I started working as a coach, before I even specialized in anything, I realized the common thread between all the clients I was seeing were they were all on statins, high blood pressure medication. They were all concerned about their heart health. They had all these conditions and diagnoses just in the background that were sort of what they had grown accustomed to in their life, that it was seen as inevitable that high blood pressure and heart disease and high cholesterol, prediabetes, insulin resistance would just be a part of their life, right? And so when I started thinking about what am I most passionate about, what's my expertise? It's behavior change, it's habit formation. Where does that intersect with the greatest need right now? And from a public health standpoint, I felt like cardiovascular disease and metabolic health were two of the key areas where those things really intersect in a meaningful way.
Oh wow, I love that. Thank you, Rachel. The you so I want to jump into behavior as well, but before we get into that, you said that your dad he he didn't have the traditional risk factors. So what do you see are the most pressing risk factors today for like type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease?
So this is an interesting thing to look at because there are the obvious things around smoking, excessive alcohol consumption, et cetera, but also some of the more nuanced areas, which would be the lifestyle factors. So sleep deprivation would be a huge one. Diet is a huge area, lack of exercise. And then I think one of the most fascinating areas, and there's a huge piece about this on the Wall Street Journal and The Economist recently, which is about this long-term Harvard study talking about the power of relationships in healthcare. And so when you think about the role that supportive relationships and communities play, this is one of the most undervalued and frankly under-researched areas of healthcare because we forget that our habits and our behaviors and our health outcomes are shaped by the people around us. They're inevitably shaped and formed by our communities. And so when you think about risk factors for diseases, a lot of times we're thinking about it on the individual level. What is it that I'm doing with my diet or my exercise that's leading me down this path, as opposed to who are the people I'm surrounding myself with? What are my neighbors doing? What are my coworkers doing? And how do all of those values, habits, principles affect and influence my health trajectory?
Wow. And I just also want to thank you for that. We have some guests here who are saying, Morning, ladies, from Marie Scott. Good morning,
Hi.
Marie. Awesome. Thank you for joining. Um, yeah, so back to that. Wow, absolutely mind blowing because I think when you are in like the motivational sphere, you're always hearing like surround yourself with the best 5 people,
Yeah.
surround yourself with leaders. But I like there's never the mention of, well, don't just surround yourself, it's actually good for your health. So I guess my question is during the pandemic, did you have more clients coming in because of that risk factor or you know like what's the impact do you find of having those relationships for your health?
So I think there are a couple key things. First of all, the pandemic opened up the fact that these diseases like type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease are all going to be just sort of like intensified in their effects because of the risk that COVID-19 poses. So people who had these conditions were more predisposed toward complications and even death when it comes to COVID. And so the pandemic highlighted the great need for addressing these conditions, both on a public health global scale, but also individually. I think for people really looking at ways to turn around their own health. Now, the isolation then complicates this picture, right? Because I think a lot of people are thinking, I want to turn around my health, I want to improve things, and yet I'm also feeling lonely. I'm not feeling supported. I don't have the gym that I would love to go to, or I don't have these opportunities for social gatherings that would provide that vibrancy and that excitement in my life that drives positive health outcomes. So the complications and just the confusion, everything that has gone on through the pandemic made this really, really tricky for people. And I think the isolation in particular meant that people had to pivot to forming social relationships in a way that they hadn't been forced to in the past. Now, my experience as a patient and having had chronic illness problems for almost a decade and a half now meant that I was uniquely predisposed to help people through that, because I was used to having to deal with that level of isolation and deal with saying no to a lot of the things that I was used to wanting to do. What we found was through the pandemic, building relationships through Zoom, FaceTime, phone calls were kind of laying the groundwork for building this new kind of framework around social relationships and communities. And the best thing for me was just to get outside and go for a hike or for a walk with people. And in doing that, you're getting activity, you're getting that social bond, you're having time in nature. Prioritizing that stuff makes such a difference in your health long term.
Oh my gosh, I love that. And I know going back to my school, a lot of people were like, "Well, I'm kind of nervous to make friends, and I'm kind of
Mhm.
nervous to do that." So, kind of getting out of that isolation, like, what's your tip to get out of that isolation or to push yourself forward to, meet new people and, get into these social gatherings?
That's a tricky one because for some people, it's super overwhelming and it's super
Mhm.
intimidating. My tip is generally to be the one who goes first. And I realize that that takes a lot of internal resolve and it's not the easiest thing to do. But when you switch your default mode from I'm going to respond to people who approach me to I'm going to be the one who introduces myself, I'm going to be the one who raises my hand and volunteers, whatever that is, when you suggest that that becomes your new status quo bias, the world just opens up because you realize that a lot of people would love for someone to text them and say, hey, let's go for a hike. They would love for someone to invite them over for dinner or to invite them to meet for lunch. They are just as excited about this as you are. And so the ROI from making that initial contact or reaching out to somebody is massive. And that's not to diminish the potential negative downsides or embarrassment that happens when people get rejected and somebody says no or whatever it is.
Mhm.
I think people vastly overestimate the frequency of that happening versus the potential upside of a new friendship or a beautiful relationship developing because you were willing to say yes and you were willing to go first.
Ah, I love that. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so for those of you who are shy out there, make the first move.
Yeah, it's important for your health.
It is, as we're hearing now. I love that. Latifa says hi as well. Hello, Latifa. Thank
Hi,
you for
Latifa.
joining. So I want to dive into behavior because you said one of your passions in kind of looking at metabolic health was behavior and I think transformation. Transformation. Was
Yeah,
that
looking at behavior change and lifestyle medicine, right? So like how do
lifestyle? Yes.
people actually change, right? What is it that what is it that entails like for somebody to go from not doing something to doing something? And that
Okay.
it's more than a doctor being like, "Hey, you need to lose weight or you need to exercise more, or you need to get better sleep."
Mhm. So could you kind of expand on that in a way that what are some of your experiences with people changing their behavior? Like what drives them to change behavior, especially when it comes to their health?
So the driving force is a really interesting thing to examine because I think a lot of people have this notion, and it's completely understandable, but it's a bit mistaken, that what drives behavior is either negativity or being really hard on yourself. So if I'm constantly beating myself up and saying, I need to do better tomorrow, that's going to make me a better person. And to a certain extent, I think there is some truth to the theory that what drives that initial change is hitting a rock bottom or experiencing severe pain. The pain is so immense that you are left with no choice but to change. But what really sustains change over time is having this positive vision of what your life could be, who you could be as a person, versus feeling that I have to constantly berate myself into making this change. I have to tell myself that I'm not good enough, or that I'm too fat, or that I'm not eating well enough, or whatever it is. And that's somehow going to drive me into becoming the person I want to be. I like to think of it instead with leading with this vision of what is your ideal life? Who is the person that you want to be when you're at your best? Not just with your health, but what kind of role do you want to play in your community? What kind of role do you want to play in your family? Do you want to be communicating and playing with your grandkids when you're older? Do you want to be out hiking, climbing Kilimanjaro, whatever it is? What are the things that excite you and drive you? Not specifically related to your health, but just in general about your life. And then backcast from that. Think about, what are the habits that I could be doing today that would support that ultimate goal of who I could be as a person? And I find that that positive vision is so much more powerful, and it's totally grounded in the research. Richard Boyatzis is a professor at Case Western and does a ton of amazing data and analysis on this field, is the one who's showing that actually having that vision of what your life could be, what your health could be, is one of the most powerful drivers included for getting people to change.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Having that positive vision. When you're working with your clients, is that the first thing you do before even like assessing them? Just like, how do you feel right now, and like where this is where we want to go?
So when I work with a new client, a lot of it comes down to, okay, what is this overarching strategy going to be? Because a lot of the people I work with come in and they have multiple diagnoses, they're on a lot of different medications, and that alone is so overwhelming. Even when they already have really great primary care doctors and specialists on their team, it's still a lot to handle as an individual and feel like I have to navigate all this stuff myself. So the first step is really just to make sense of everything that's going on. Where are potential gaps in care? Where are the areas where they can have a little bit more strategic action in place? And then start with, okay, let's identify and articulate your unique vision of well-being. What does life look like when you are healthy and feeling well? What does it mean for you to really be healthy? And I find that what you see from your clients is that things that they're excited about are totally surprising. People are driven by passions and hobbies that you have no idea about. I remember listening to an interview with Atul Gawande, who's a surgeon at Harvard and writes for the New Yorker. And he was talking about how his mom had had surgery on her knee, and he didn't understand why she wasn't following through with physical therapy. Now, compliance in PT, I feel like, is no surprise. Like, everybody who's been through an injury knows what it's like to like go meet with your physical therapist and then come home and you have this set of exercises, and maybe you do them, maybe you don't. But it's not something that everybody just automatically does. And he couldn't get why his mom, who had been this like avid tennis player, wasn't following through with her exercises. And he's like, "Mom, don't you want to get back to playing tennis?" And she's like, "No, I just don't want to be in pain anymore." When you have that disconnect between what the patient wants, what the client wants, and what the provider is assuming they want, you get this misalignment and you have these issues around compliance. But really, it's the fact that people's goals are just completely different. And if you're not able to account for that divergence, you're going to assume that your client isn't being compliant, instead of thinking about, okay, what is the client actually wanting in their life? What is it that drives them? And how do I help them? How do I facilitate that change so that they get to that point?
I like that. I really like the framework there, and the fact that you were kind of like, you're saying that, not saying, but you're showing that misalignment there. I really like that story to kind of show that, here she was a former tennis player, but now she just doesn't want to get back to it, to show how quickly people's goals do change, right? It's like you want something and then you don't want it in the next. And so I think that is one of your frameworks to having a vision. Is there another framework to building healthy habits that you really like, that you think is more important than the rest?
I think the vision thing is so important because that's like the North Star. That's what is really guiding this whole process. And then I also like to think in terms of investment framework. So there's so many parallels to the financial world that I find really interesting. And I work with a lot of middle-aged men, so it's helpful to be able to speak their language, right? But basically understanding that small habits accrue over time and end up generating massive gains. This is absolutely true in investing. You see how the power of compounding means that small amounts that are invested now in your 20s or 30s are going to galvanize into something much, much bigger in your 50s, 60s, and 70s. When people come to me and they think about health habits, a lot of times people are thinking on a really large scale. They want to lose 40 pounds. They want to get off their medications, whatever it is. And so it's hard for them to conceptualize that something small and everyday could over time get them where they want to go. It's usually coming in with this very binary, all or nothing, black and white thinking. So the positive aspect of this is that people understand that small daily habits, going for a walk, getting outdoor light exposure, going to bed earlier, spending time with loved ones, building their friendships, all that stuff matters over time. And they start to realize that those habits are enjoyable and meaningful in and of themselves, rather than assuming that I'm only doing this because I think it's going to help me lose weight in the end. People start to value and start to enjoy the inputs, as opposed to only thinking that what matters is these massive things that show up on a scale or show up on a lab report.
I like that. And then I think what they don't realize is that the big massive thing happens at the end. And once you've built up those healthy habits, then you can see the bigger picture. I
Totally.
love
It's like a side effect, honestly. Like, I don't target weight loss specifically. I think of it as a product of all these other things that are going right in your life, versus we're going to start off with, severe calorie deficits or whatever. No, instead think about what is it that you're going to be doing on a daily, weekly, monthly basis that you enjoy, that's meaningful for you, that's in line with your values, and that's something that is actually exciting. And so I think when it comes to movement, people start to rediscover practices that they enjoyed when they were kids, or sports that they enjoy playing when they're older, as opposed to feeling like this has to be this like draconian, super intense, like, drive yourself crazy. Yeah, exactly. Just super intense gym workouts or whatever. No, it can be outside playing Frisbee with your friends.
Yeah, and then you're also building that connection as well. Rachel, I think in your bio, it also you put like you like to party and like you have boats and stuff like that. So, is
Oh,
there
that
any
was their
sports?
party.
Yeah, are those your social activities? Like, what are you doing, and what are you doing for your metabolic health? I'm very interested. Like, you seem like a very fun person.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I love when I get called fun, because I always think of myself as not being very fun. But yes, I'm totally fun. I am so much fun. You have no idea. I love throwing dinner parties. I love to cook. And so having an opportunity to bring people together over food is one of my favorite things in the world. And honestly, that's how I built a lot of my friendships through college, through post-college years when I was living in new cities, was inviting people over for dinner and realizing that that was going to be a really great way to build a community. And I also have gotten involved in sailboat racing over the past few years, and that's a really fun social community. I am by no means an expert sailor. I am thoroughly mediocre, and yet I've realized that being in a sport as an adult where I'm far from the best in the room is such a humbling, important experience to have. But it's also been an incredible way to build relationships, to build friendships, and understand that all these things can be done simultaneously. I don't have to section my life into, this is my workout, and then I'm going to hang out with my friends, and then I'm going to go eat my food or whatever. I can combine all these things into something that's far more transformational than if I were to try to do it individually.
I like that. That is a really good point to have, because I think we tend to, even myself, section out different times and like, okay, now I'm going to eat, now I'm going to go work out. And you don't realize that when you do these activities, a lot of those things are already meshed together, but we're purposely pulling them apart to say, okay, this is the kind of structure that we need, instead of being like free flowing and, in there and like having fun, like you said, having those humbling experiences.
Mm-hmm.
As a health coach, is there like do you give your friends like super healthy meals when they come over for dinner? Is it like the top healthiest recipe with
Oh
all
my
the
gosh.
dark
No.
greens?
For starters, so I like food. My philosophy is food that happens to be healthy. I don't do a lot of food that is healthy. Like, I think frustration around a lot of recipes is that they're designed around a specific diet or condition or something, as opposed to thinking about what's going to be most flavorful. What are the techniques that are most appropriate for this cut of meat or these vegetables or whatever, and then just modify it if necessary for whatever food allergy or intolerance or condition that you're dealing with. So I'll have clients come to me and they're like, oh, I love recipes from Ina Garten, Barefoot Contessa, right? But I know those aren't healthy. And I'm like, what do you know? Look at her cookbooks and think about cooking a roasted chicken with vegetables, or making a beautiful salad with a French herb vinaigrette. These are foods that have been honestly stood the test of time because they are delicious, they're sustainable, they're healthy. And they happen to incorporate a lot of seasonal produce. They're things that are easy to cook. So when I have a dinner party with my friends, I'm thinking about what's flavorful, what's delicious, and what's going to bring people together rather than telling people that we are only going to be eating like, unsalted lentils or something. Although I love lentils, so no shame
Not the unsalted lentils.
there. Right. Oh,
Those
again,
are
like
the appetizer. It's
yeah,
like,
so
okay,
boring.
Rachel, we're just gonna bring food next time, and
Yeah,
you don't have to cook. Don't worry
right.
about
Yeah, exactly. Here's your,
it.
unseasoned Ezekiel bread, sprouted stuff. I mean, I grew up like in a very healthy, like health conscious household. I'm very like I understand the whole wellness culture stuff. I have my problems with it, but I just find that when it comes to food, start with joy. People have such fraught relationships with food, and so many women and even men I've chatted with, clients or otherwise, have talked about the complicated relationship they have with food. So I never want to start with deprivation or suggesting that certain foods are worse than others. I want to think in terms of appropriateness and portion size, because there's some foods that are amazing to have for a celebration, but I'm not going to eat them every day. And I don't want to demonize certain foods and give people the impression that things are clean or unclean. I want to instead try to generate joy and excitement and a love of the process, and understand that food can be a celebration and a place for bonding and community, as opposed to something that generates anxiety and fear and regret and shame.
Hmm. Interesting take. Okay. I think this is a silly question, but I'm still gonna ask. Do
Do
you
it.
think when you eat food with joy that it digests better in your body?
Yes, although I have no way to prove this. It's only
Oh, okay.
anecdotal, but I remember listening to, this is tangentially related to what you're saying, but I think what you're getting at is that there's something that happens physiologically, hormonally, emotionally when you are sharing a meal with people you love, or you're feeling happy about what you're eating, you're experiencing pleasure in a healthy way, versus the sense that people have when it's, they're on a cleanse or they're on a really rigid diet. And there's a hatred that it evolves. There's this sort of like, oh, I'm doing this thing. I'm just going to shove this food down my throat. I know it doesn't taste good, but I need to lose the weight or whatever. I remember listening to an interview with one of my favorite doctors, Dr. Ron Sinha. He does a lot of work with South Asian populations in the Bay Area. And he was talking about how he'd have patients who would go back to their families in India, and they'd be eating whatever their family was eating. They weren't paying attention to their diet. They weren't doing some rigid CrossFit workout multiple times a day, whatever it was. And they would come back feeling amazing. Their blood pressure had
Mhm.
improved, their weight maybe had dropped a little bit, but they were realizing that that role of enjoyment and community and support from these relationships was really beneficial for people who are otherwise really stressed out. And so I think what you're getting at is this larger picture of how do you build a life that fosters these values
Mhm.
versus thinking that you are on your own trying to just like muscle your way toward health. Instead, think about like what are the supportive structures that make this much more enjoyable and lovely and pleasurable versus draconian and intense and deprivation and all that stuff.
Oh my gosh, this is great. Rachel, thank you. This is a very beautiful way to introduce a lot of these values because like
Mhm.
you said, I think sometimes we hear it's very cut and dry. It's like, okay, here's the step by step by step. But similar experiences, I know some of my family members, similar stories that they will go back to, we're Guyanese, so they would go back to Guyana and
Mhm.
they would have the food there and the sun and it's hot and they would have the best time ever, like no skin problems, no um like food problems, whatever it is, and still feel good. And as soon as they come back to Canada, oh my God, then it all starts.
Right.
And different things like that. But also leads me into my next question as to say, um, does your health change with the seasons? Like, is there any habits that you need to adjust because, oh, it's winter or it's summer? Like, how do you keep it consistent throughout the year, throughout the seasonal changes?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I love Chinese medicine. I, as a patient, work with a wonderful Chinese medicine doctor, and he's always talking about the importance of living in accordance with nature. So when the seasons change, different organ systems in the Chinese medicine world start to take precedence, right? And so the governing system in the winter is the kidney system, and that means it's a more of a time for reflection, contemplation, withdrawing a little bit. So naturally, when we feel this desire to hibernate, it's understandable because this is what our bodies are set up to do. Now, that can be taken to the extreme and you isolate too much, but I think it's important to understand that when it's colder and it's darker, that does mean that there's an opportunity for maybe a little bit more sleep at night, a little bit slower, a little bit more contemplation in your life. Thinking about foods that are warming and things like roasted squash and cooked vegetables and roasted meats. I love doing that as opposed to the summer when I'm eating lots of like seafood and bright, crunchy salads and slaws and fresh vegetables and fruit. In the winter, it's a very different approach to food. And I think my activity as well fluctuates with the season. So I love this idea of living seasonally.
Hmm.
Exposure to sunlight, time outdoors is something that is consistent year round for me, but it changes. In the wintertime, it's bundling up and going for a walk, as opposed to in the summertime when I'm getting out and I'm sailing or I'm swimming. And it's really important, especially when you're thinking about seasonal affective disorder, winter blues, to get as much outdoor light exposure as you can. And if you can't get outside because it's a blizzard and it's blowing 60 miles an hour,
Mhm.
then use your like influencer ring light. These things aren't just for vanity. These are, this can give you a little bit of a boost, but just getting out in the morning like today, shoveling snow for 20 minutes, something like
Mhm.
that, even when it's overcast, you're still getting the benefit from sunlight. You just need to be outside for a little bit more. And making sure that you prioritize that time goes a long way towards setting your circadian rhythms and also helping with the mood effects that you might experience in the winter.
Oh my goodness, I love that. Wait, so are you saying my computer screen is giving me my light now?
Not
Is
your
this
computer
the new
screen. So if you have a
reverse?
ring light, I was listening, Andrew Huberman was talking about this. So a lot of, in the past decade, I think these like happy lights where you have these little light
Mhm.
boxes, you can get those off Amazon or whatever. So those emit the lights that are supposed to mimic what you get from the sun. Now, obviously it's not as good as being outside, but it's an appropriate substitute. But there's a similarity between the light that's emitted from one of those boxes that's designed for seasonal affective disorder and what you get from a ring light. So if you have a giant ring light that you're using to light your face for all your Zoom calls or your TikToks or whatever, that
Mhm.
can be, an appropriate, like a reasonable substitute. But obviously, sunlight outside is best. That's the gold standard.
I love that. I love how it's not like put your ring light and then start tanning.
Yeah,
Just
exactly. Right. And also be careful of the timing of this. Like, so you don't
yeah.
want to be doing that at night. You don't want to be like staring at your screens before bed because that's going to mess up your sleep quality. But if you can do that in the morning, that's going to be a different story.
Interesting. I love that. Thank you, Rachel. And that we have some good love from the comments. Latifah's giving you claps. BB is giving you love. And Marie Scott, I think back when we were talking about the joy of food, said absolutely and agreed with you. So we are about to wrap up, but to bring it all in, you are one of the authors in this Wellness Wisdom Volume 2 series, the book. So I
Yeah.
just want to ask, like, why did you decide to become an author?
Oh, that's such a great question. I actually always enjoyed writing, and newspaper was one of my favorite things in high school. So when I think about how I want to communicate what it is that I'm passionate about,
Hmm.
I'm thinking about how do I do this in different mediums? And obviously, being on social media, doing interviews like this, doing podcasts is super important, but also writing things down, not just because it's a way to disseminate information, but the pure act of writing just forces you to think in a different way. For me, putting my thoughts out into paper is how I organize them in a more meaningful way. And so doing something like that to share what it is that's been transformational for my own life and for my clients is super important to me. And I don't want this to be my last attempt. I hope this is just the beginning when it comes to my writing.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Woohoo. I love when it's like, I want to keep writing. I want to keep doing this because it's so nice to actually have a book in your hand and feel it and actually read it and take it in.
Mm-hmm.
It's just information and gold that's always going to stay with you forever. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, Rachel. And very cool that you were on the newspaper team in your school. Um, Before we end off here, what's next for you and how can people reach you?
So if people want to be in touch, I'm at Rachel Horton Wellness on TikTok and Instagram. And if they want to go to my website, it's rachelhorton.me. I am seeking, I am looking at integrating more about what I'm learning in Chinese medicine into my practice. So when I look into the next year or two, I think that's going to be the biggest frontier is how do I integrate these different paradigms when it comes to healthcare in a way that's really transformational for clients. I love taking the best of Western academic medicine research and also looking at these healing traditions like Chinese medicine that have developed really, really wonderful systems for helping people heal and helping people really hone their nutrition, their lifestyle, their movement practices in a way that allows them to make the coming decades of their life even better than the previous ones.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. Marie's giving you a nice heart. Shami's saying good morning to you. And Rachel, thank you so much for joining us on today's segment here at our Wellness Wisdom Volume 2 series. I do hope to see that you get more into Chinese medicine. It seems very, very interesting, and
Mm-hmm.
that people will reach out to you and follow you on TikTok because now I do know you have a ring light. And getting that sunlight.
Yeah.
And yeah, and thank you so much. It has been wonderful talking to you. Thank you to our viewers who have joined in with Rachel and I on a Sunday morning.
Yes.
So really soaking it in. And I hope you have a wonderful day. This was presented by APSO, awesome people shaping our world. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thanks, Raisa.
Thank you. Bye.